In a small village, there lived a woman named Zara, who, despite experiencing immense heartache, could never shed a tear. No one could understand why, not even her closest friends. The absence of tears was as mysterious as the pain that lingered in her eyes. But when a sudden, shocking change occurs in her life, the reason behind her inability to cry is finally revealed, and it's more powerful than anyone could have imagined. Zara was a woman of mystery in her small village. The locals saw her as a symbol of strength, someone who had weathered life's harshest storms without a single tear. Yet, behind her composed exterior, a deep and unspoken pain lingered. The loss of her mother when she was young, followed by a series of disappointments in her adult life, had hardened her heart. While the other women in the village cried when they experienced heartache, Zara did not. The absence of tears became her identity. It wasn't that she didn't feel the pain, it was far from it. It was just that the tears never came. She had tried. Countless times, she stood in front of the mirror, willing herself to let go, hoping to release her grief. But nothing happened. Her body betrayed her. She couldn't cry. Over time, this unusual silence began to puzzle everyone around her. Zara's friends and family noticed her lack of emotion and couldn't understand how she could endure so much sorrow without breaking down. Her eyes, though filled with a sadness they could never quite place, remained dry, unwavering. People began to question her strength. Does she not care? Some whispered. Is she made of stone? Others wondered. The truth was that Zara cared deeply. Her heart ached, but her body just would not release the emotions. It was as though there was an invisible wall around her heart, one that kept her pain locked inside, hidden from view. It wasn't just her pain that made others uneasy, it was the fact that Zara never seemed to show it. She didn't speak about her struggles. She didn't complain. She carried on with her daily life as though everything was fine, even though her soul was often heavy. She was a caretaker, always looking after others, offering a comforting presence to her neighbors, yet never allowing anyone to truly comfort her. She had long ago stopped seeking solace, and instead, she threw herself into her work. She cared for children, assisted the elderly, and was always there for her friends in their times of need. Zara was known as the person everyone could count on. But when it came to herself, there was no one to turn to. She bottled it all up. She had learned to endure the pain silently, and though she never spoke of it, her sadness was evident in the way she carried herself. Her body seemed to hold the weight of the world. Zara's inability to cry was not a choice, it was as if her emotions had been frozen in time, unable to surface no matter how much she wanted them to. She could feel the hurt deep within her, but it was as though a switch inside her had been flipped off, no tears, no release. As years passed, she began to fear that something was wrong with her. The thought that she might be broken or incapable of truly expressing herself terrified her. But the fear of showing vulnerability kept her locked in a cage of her own making. She told herself she didn't need to cry. She had made it this far without it, so why should she change now? Zara began to wonder if the absence of tears was some kind of shield she had built to protect herself from the overwhelming emotions that came with loss. Maybe if she didn't cry, the pain wouldn't be so intense. She didn't know for sure, but the logic seemed to make sense. Yet, deep down, she knew it wasn't healthy. She couldn't let go of the emotions that threatened to suffocate her, and no matter how hard she tried, they never seemed to be released. She watched as others wept, letting their sorrow flow freely, while she stood on the outside, watching as if she were somehow detached from the whole human experience. This distance from her emotions created a growing sense of isolation. While everyone around her was open, expressive, and vulnerable, Zara remained distant and guarded. She avoided situations that might trigger an emotional response, and she kept conversations light, steering clear of anything too personal. But the emotional repression was taking its toll on her. She often felt a strange emptiness, a sense of disconnection from her own soul. The ache inside her intensified with each passing day, but still, no tears came. It was as if her body had forgotten how to cry, or perhaps, it had forgotten the purpose of the tears altogether. Her inability to cry weighed heavily on her, causing a sense of powerlessness. She saw herself as a spectator in the emotional lives of others, and she longed to be able to express herself the way they could. But she had become so accustomed to holding everything in that she didn't know how to start. The thought of truly letting go was terrifying. Would she lose control? Would the floodgates open, and would she be able to handle the release of all that pain? She didn't know, but she continued to repress it. At night, when Zara was alone in her room, she often lay awake in the dark, staring at the ceiling, wondering what was wrong with her. Why couldn't she cry? Why had she built this wall around her emotions? She had been through so much, yet she couldn't let herself release the pain that had accumulated over the years. The burden of not being able to cry felt heavier than the grief itself. The emotional numbness was suffocating, and it became increasingly difficult for Zara to keep up the act of strength. She couldn't keep pretending that everything was fine. Deep inside, she knew that if she didn't find a way to release her emotions, the pain would only continue to grow, threatening to swallow her whole. Zara's story is one of quiet suffering, one that many in the village never fully understood. She was always the strong one, the one who never showed weakness, and though she longed for release, she was too afraid to let go. Little did anyone know, the moment of release was approaching, and it would be a turning point in Zara's life, a moment that would change everything. What she didn't realize was that her inability to cry was not a weakness, but a silent plea for help, and when that moment finally came, it would reveal a truth more powerful than anyone could have ever imagined. Zara's life had always been a delicate balance between holding everything together and keeping the pain at bay. Her inability to cry had become a defining feature of her identity. The other villagers often admired her for her strength, but Zara knew that behind her composed facade, something was terribly wrong. She was drowning in emotions that she had no way to express. While other women in the village would cry, grieve, and share their pain, Zara felt trapped in a silent world where the release of emotions seemed impossible. The people around her, her closest friends, had begun to notice that Zara was different. They could see it in the way her eyes would become misty at times, how her voice would quiver when she spoke about her past, yet no tears ever formed. They asked her, gently, why she never cried. Some would suggest she should let it out, that it was okay to show weakness sometimes. But Zara always reassured them with a smile, telling them she was fine, that everything was under control. She had become so skilled at masking her pain that it had almost become second nature. To everyone else, Zara was the perfect picture of strength and resilience, but inside, she was crumbling. Her inability to cry wasn't a choice. It wasn't something she had intentionally decided. It had just become the way she functioned, a pattern formed over years of loss and disappointment. When her mother died unexpectedly, Zara's world had shattered. She was just a child, and the pain was too much to bear. But no matter how much her heart ached, the tears never came. She tried to cry for her mother, but all she felt was a hollow emptiness that seemed to consume her. This absence of tears lingered with her into adulthood, and each time something tragic happened, the same silence surrounded her emotions. The people around her couldn't understand it. To them, tears were a natural response to pain. Why couldn't Zara cry? Why was she always so composed? The longer Zara went without crying, the more isolated she became. She began to pull away from her friends and family, afraid they would judge her for not expressing herself the way they did. She could hear their whispered concerns, their confused conversations about her inability to let go. They didn't know what it was like to carry pain without a release. They didn't understand that she wasn't choosing this silence, it was something she couldn't control. It was a struggle she faced every day, feeling as though her emotions were locked inside her and there was no key to set them free. One afternoon, as Zara sat by the riverbank, she overheard a conversation between two of her friends. They were talking about their own emotional experiences, how they had cried when they faced difficulties in their lives. One of them mentioned that crying had helped her feel lighter, as though the burden had been lifted once the tears flowed. Zara felt a pang of envy. She longed to feel that sense of release, to know what it was like to shed the weight of her emotions. But no matter how much she wished for it, she couldn't bring herself to cry. She wasn't sure if she had forgotten how or if the tears simply refused to come because her mind had conditioned her to suppress them for so long. Her heart yearned for release, but Zara had learned to repress her feelings over the years. She had trained herself to hold it all in, to never let anyone see the depth of her pain. The belief that being strong meant showing no vulnerability had been ingrained in her since childhood. She thought that if she appeared to be unaffected by her circumstances, she would be able to maintain control over her life. But the more she held it in, the more isolated she felt. She was missing the connection that others had, the ability to lean on each other in times of grief, to support and be supported through vulnerability. Zara couldn't deny that something was missing in her life. She watched the other women cry together, sharing their burdens and comforting one another. They seemed to have a bond that she didn't fully understand. It wasn't that Zara didn't want that connection, she simply couldn't seem to access the outlet that others had. The more she tried to push away her emotions, the heavier they felt. It was as though they were pressing against a wall she had built around herself, and the wall was starting to crack. The emotional release that so many people took for granted seemed like a foreign concept to her. There were moments when Zara would catch herself thinking, if only I could cry, everything would be better. But those moments were fleeting, and soon enough, she would bury those thoughts again, hiding behind the mask of strength. The pressure of pretending to be unaffected was growing, and Zara knew that it couldn't last forever. She had started to wonder if this emotional barrier was a defense mechanism she had developed to protect herself from the overwhelming sadness she had buried deep inside. The thought that she might be shutting herself off from healing terrified her, but she had no idea how to break the pattern. One evening, as Zara sat alone in her room, she finally admitted to herself that something had to change. She couldn't go on pretending that everything was fine. She could no longer ignore the ache in her heart. The emotional walls she had built were no longer serving her, they were keeping her trapped in a cycle of pain and isolation. The weight of her own silence felt unbearable. Zara was tired of pretending she was fine. She wanted to heal. She wanted to feel. But how could she let go of something that had been a part of her for so long? How could she allow herself to be vulnerable after years of holding everything inside? The journey ahead would not be easy, but for the first time in years, Zara felt a glimmer of hope. The first step toward healing was acknowledging the pain. And now that she had finally done that, the path to emotional release had begun, even if she couldn't see where it would lead. Zara had spent years hiding behind a wall of strength, afraid that if she let her emotions surface, they would overwhelm her. But that evening, as she sat in the dim light of her room, she felt something shift inside her. She had been fighting against herself for so long, trying to suppress the grief, but it was clear that the battle was no longer hers to fight alone. Something inside her stirred, a desire for release, for healing, for the freedom that tears could bring. The realization that she had been holding everything in for so long was sobering. Zara knew she couldn't keep pretending. For years, she had told herself that not crying was a sign of strength. She had believed that by refusing to let the tears fall, she was somehow protecting herself. But now, the weight of that belief was suffocating her. It was as if all the emotions she had buried were too much for her to carry alone. The heaviness in her chest was unbearable, and her heart ached for the release she had denied herself for so long. Zara couldn't explain it, but she knew it was time. Time to stop running from her emotions, time to stop pretending that everything was fine. For the first time in a long while, Zara made the decision to face herself, to embrace the vulnerability she had spent years avoiding. She wasn't sure how she would do it, but she knew she had to try. The pain had been building up for so long that she felt like if she didn't let it go now, it might consume her. The next day, Zara found herself by the river, the place where she had often sought solace in the past. It had always been a peaceful spot for her, a place where she could think and reflect. The sound of the flowing water calmed her, but today, something was different. Today, she wasn't just reflecting on her thoughts. Today, she was prepared to let go. She sat by the edge of the river, looking out at the flowing water, her heart heavy with all the unspoken grief she had carried for so long. Tears began to well up in her eyes, and for a moment, Zara froze. She had not allowed herself to cry in years, and the sudden rush of emotions overwhelmed her. She didn't know whether she should stop or let it all go. But something in her clicked, and instead of holding back, she let the tears fall freely. The first tear trickled down her cheek, followed by another, and then another. It was as if a dam had broken, releasing everything she had been holding inside. Zara sobbed, her body shaking with the intensity of the release. The tears flowed freely, washing away years of pain, grief, and frustration. She wasn't sure how long she sat there, crying, but it felt like the weight of the world had lifted from her shoulders. For the first time in years, Zara felt lighter. She felt as though a part of her that had been dormant for so long had awakened. In those moments, she wasn't just letting go of tears, she was letting go of the emotional armor she had built around herself. The tears that had once been trapped inside her now flowed freely, and with each tear, she felt more at peace. As the last tear fell, Zara felt a deep sense of relief. It wasn't just the physical release, it was as if her entire body had exhaled. She realized that the tears were not a sign of weakness, but a symbol of healing. In that moment, she understood that crying was not something to fear. It wasn't something to hide from, it was a natural and necessary part of the human experience. Zara had spent so many years thinking that crying was a sign of vulnerability she couldn't afford, but now, she saw it for what it truly was, a powerful tool for emotional release and healing. The transformation she experienced that day was profound. Zara was no longer the woman who bottled everything up, the one who carried her pain in silence. She was now someone who had confronted her emotions and allowed herself to feel. The relief she felt was immeasurable, and she knew that this was only the beginning of her healing journey. The tears had opened the door to something deeper, a sense of self-awareness that she had never fully understood before. She had spent so much time avoiding her emotions, but now, she was finally giving herself permission to feel them fully. When Zara returned to the village, her friends and family immediately noticed the change in her. There was a softness in her demeanor, a warmth in her eyes that hadn't been there before. The wall she had built around herself seemed to have come down. People no longer saw the woman who was constantly in control, but someone who had embraced her vulnerability and allowed herself to heal. Zara felt more connected to those around her, as though she had opened herself up in ways she had never thought possible. She wasn't afraid to show her emotions anymore. She understood that crying wasn't a weakness, but a strength, a way to acknowledge the pain and begin the process of healing. Zara's journey from emotional repression to emotional release was transformative, not just for her, but for those around her as well. Her willingness to embrace her vulnerability inspired others in the village to do the same. They saw Zara's strength in her ability to let go, to face her pain, and to rise above it. The lesson Zara learned that day by the river wasn't just about crying, it was about embracing all parts of herself, including the painful ones. She had spent so long running from her emotions, afraid of what they might do, but now she knew that by allowing herself to cry, she had opened the door to her own personal growth. Zara had learned that the power to heal lay not in avoiding the pain, but in allowing herself to experience it fully, to release it, and to move forward stronger than before. As Zara looked at the river, the sunlight dancing on its surface, she realized that her emotional journey had only just begun. The tears had been the first step in reclaiming herself. And though the road ahead would still have its challenges, Zara knew that she now had the strength to face whatever came her way. She had learned that the key to healing wasn't in avoiding the pain, but in embracing it and allowing herself the freedom to let go. Zara's life began to shift after that transformative moment by the river. The tears she had long denied finally flowed, and with them came a deep sense of liberation. For the first time in years, she felt like she had truly released the weight she had carried silently for so long. It was as though her heart had been unburdened, and her soul had breathed a sigh of relief. The relief wasn't instant, but it was profound. She felt lighter, freer, and more connected to herself than ever before. When she returned to the village, her friends and family noticed the change immediately. There was something different about Zara now, a softness in her eyes, a warmth in her voice, and a vulnerability she had never shown before. The stoic woman they had known was no longer hiding behind a wall of strength. She had shed that armor, and in its place, she carried a quiet strength that came from embracing her emotions. She felt more present in her relationships, more willing to share not just her joys, but her struggles as well. Zara's newfound openness began to change the way she interacted with the people around her. In the past, she had been the one to offer support, always ready to lend a helping hand to others, but never allowing anyone to help her in return. Now, she found herself reaching out more. She spoke openly with her friends about her journey, explaining how her inability to cry had kept her emotionally trapped. She shared the struggles she had faced, the pain that had built up inside her, and the breakthrough she had experienced by finally allowing herself to feel. Her honesty and vulnerability created a ripple effect. People around her began to open up too. The other women in the village, who had always admired Zara's strength, began to see her in a new light. They realized that strength didn't mean suppressing emotions. Zara's emotional release taught them that true strength came from facing one's feelings, acknowledging pain, and allowing oneself to heal. They saw how Zara had changed, how she had embraced her vulnerability and found peace, and many of them were inspired to do the same. Zara's transformation also affected her relationships with those closest to her. In the past, her husband, Jomo, had been supportive, but he never fully understood why Zara struggled with her emotions. Like the others, he had seen her as a pillar of strength. Now, with Zara opening up about her struggles, Jomo began to realize the depth of her emotional pain. He was shocked to learn that Zara had been silently suffering, feeling alone in her grief, and unable to cry. He had never seen her this way, and it made him reflect on his own role in their relationship. Zara's emotional release had not only opened her up but had also opened Jomo's heart. He became more attuned to Zara's needs, more understanding of the importance of emotional vulnerability. Together, they navigated this new chapter in their marriage, one built on a foundation of deeper empathy and mutual support. In the weeks that followed, Zara's emotional healing became a process of continual growth. She did not expect the journey to be easy. There were moments of doubt, times when the old walls of emotional repression would try to rise up again, but Zara was determined not to retreat. Each day, she worked to confront her emotions head-on. She meditated, journaled, and took time to reflect on her feelings. She found comfort in expressing herself more freely.